this is probably the most interesting time in my entire career. The dot-com bubble was very exciting, but I think the AI revolution is bigger. We can get in, people can get in while it's early, and they can write. It's a rocket, it's a bang. I've been extremely critical of the lack of good usability in AI products. I mean, they have not done the entire user-centered design lifecycle that I've been promoting for 42 years. They have not actually done that. It's been extremely engineering focused. If AI can make people twice as productive, which I think is very realistic for the next few years, we can fire half the people because the other half can then do all the work. And that would be true if there was a fixed amount of work to be done in the world, but that is not the case.
The following is a conversation with somebody who I can't even believe I'm about to introduce this person. This person has had a huge impact actually on me personally throughout my career. The business that he found essentially is the model that VUX follows to this day and was actually created purposefully off the back of the business that he created. He's got over 40 years of experience in user experience design, the godfather actually of user experience design. He created the 10 usability heuristics, which every UX designer and UI designer across the world will probably know better than the back of their hand. He was named the king of usability by Internet Magazine, the guru of web page usability by the New York Times, and the next best thing to a true time machine by USA Today. He is a published author with more than 8 best-selling books. One of them, the best-selling Designing Web Usability, The Practice of Simplicity, published in 22 languages. Usability Engineering, cited 27,500 times by Google. He holds 79 United States patents and also has a Lifetime Achievement Award for human-computer interaction practice. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'm not even going to introduce the topic of this conversation. You're just going to have to strap yourself in because it is one of the best yet with the formidable, the legendary Jakob Nielsen. Jakob Nielsen, welcome to VUX World, my friend.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is great. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me. I must start with a thank you because when I first got into anything to do with technology, really, my whole career has been spent in technology, and my first job was at a marketing agency, and before I even realized it, I was involved in user experience design almost accidentally. And have a guess what the resource was that basically taught me everything I know about UX design? Nielsen Norman.
Oh, thank you.
Jakob
Well,
Nielsen.
that's a little bit of a common story that people stumble into it because user experience has not been that well defined or that well, I would say, established until recently. So anybody who is like an old timer, and I just mean anybody with more than 10 years, really, so not that old, but anybody who's an old timer, they usually just stumbled into it. And they have, if you look at things like degrees, which actually don't even matter, but I've talked to people with degrees in so many different things like Egyptology and I don't know what, and it just almost doesn't matter because what matters is to care about humans and to observe humans. I should put that too. Observing users, that's how we learn about what works in design.
Absolutely. And I was so much of a fan of Nielsen Norman and your whole approach that actually VUX World, our current company, is essentially modeled on Nielsen Norman. It's got the content and the thought leadership, it's got the training, and it's got the consultancy. So I've basically replicated, or tried to at least, obviously nowhere near as good, but the whole kind of concept is being basically replicated with us. So that's how much I've kind of consumed your content over the years. So thank you for everything you've done.
Oh, you're welcome. Good luck.
Yeah. So I've over the last kind of few years since 2022, that's when I think a lot of people started getting really interested in AI. Obviously, there's been various types of AI that have existed long before ChatGPT, but that seems to be the thing that's put large language models onto everyone's radar. And it seems to me from following you and reading your kind of thought process and stuff like that, you've really thrown yourself into the world of AI over the last few years. So, like, what is it that's kind of led you from being, I suppose, predominantly the founder and godfather, if you like, of the whole UX space, to now being really so bullish about AI?
Just that it's become useful. I should say it's not completely new to me to be interested in AI, because I went to my first artificial intelligence conference in Tokyo in 1988, I believe, so a very, very long time ago. But I was interested, but it was very clear from that conference and from reading the papers and everything that AI couldn't actually do anything real for the world. It was more of an academic, interesting thing, absolutely, but not useful thing. And I've always been more interested in usefulness of technology and in making it more useful, which is why I focused on usability. Because we need computers to not just be theoretically able to do things, but practically able to do things with people. And if humans cannot understand a feature, that feature might as well not be there. So AI was always there. I was always interested, but it was useless. And what has happened actually over these many decades is continued growth. I'll give you just a little poem here. I've heard it told, if you spend more gold, that old AI gets mighty bold. And so as this is called scaling laws in a more kind of nerdy phrase, but if we scale up AI, it actually does get better. And it was just not possible in the old days to build, training centers with 100,000 GPU chips, but now we can. And so now we can build these much bigger artificial brains, which means that they actually now have become useful. And so to me, that was very clear. I wouldn't necessarily say in 22 when ChatGPT 3.5 came out. I thought that was an interesting development. It was the first AI you could really communicate with, and it was interesting. But actually, GPT-4 in March of 23, I remember this very, very clearly, because that's exactly the same month I actually retired from doing a consulting business and became an independent influencer in April. So exactly when I stopped doing all the old legacy work is when the new world kind of really started. And so I think it was obvious to me in April, in April 23, once I started using the new GPT-4, that now it was in fact a real business tool. There were also some early research studies that came out back then that showed rather big productivity gains from users using these AI tools. It controlled experiments when they had some people do the work the old-fashioned way manually, and other people, this was business professionals, other people doing it with GPT-4, and they were like, I think 30% more efficient or something like that. So not just 1 or 2%, but big gains, because I've done this type of work for decades, and I know that usually you only get a few percent if you do a great work in designing something, a new tool. So this was a measurable, huge gain. And so that's why I say, okay, this is real. I mean, I can try it out and I can tell that it's a real product. It does something interesting, but also in business, it actually improves productivity, which is, I mean, if it doesn't pay for itself, then it's for nothing. So that's, I can very clearly kind of date it to when I started thinking AI is now the big thing. And that was April of 23. And I think a lot of people were hung up there in 23 on sort of this model of saying AI is like an intern. It's an eager student, but it's not that smart. And that was probably true in 93. But then in 94, the models became much better. In 95, they've become even better. If you think of something like deep research from OpenAI and from Google. They have two products with the same name, but they also do the same thing, which is they dig deep into the available information and they synthesize a report that is much better actually than a lot of consulting reports, I have to say, given that I used to be a consultant. So deep research is honestly more on the level of a PhD, a researcher. Maybe not on the level of like Nobel Prize winner or super genius, anything like that, but it's actually very, very good. And that's just in 2 years we've had this progress that AI has up-leveled that much. And I think one of the things a lot of people do not understand is exponential growth, because exponential growth is like it goes slow, it creeps on the x-axis, it hugs the x-axis for years, even if it every year is improving by 50% or something. 50% of nothing is still nothing, or 50% of almost nothing is also still almost nothing. So every year it's got a little bit better, blah, blah, blah. It's so flat. So if you look at that AI curve, for years it's been so flat. And then we're in the bend now. We're not in that kind of vertical takeoff phase. That's coming in maybe 27 or maybe even not until 2030. It's hard to say exactly when we're going to get super intelligence, but it's very clear that the curve has been flat and now it's bending, and then it's going to go whoa up like a rocket. And with the same improvement percentage, it's exponential growth. But that's a characteristic of exponential growth curves, is that it looks like nothing is happening for decades, and then all of a sudden it looks like everything is happening. And in fact, in the long-term perspective, it has been exponential growth all the time, just from starting from a very low point.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think Ray Kurzweil is also of that opinion that it potentially could be within kind of like 10, maybe 5 even years away from being like significantly more advanced than it is now. And if it continues at an exponential trend, then obviously it kind of will be. And I think going back to what you were saying there in terms of like, it's only recently that AI has been kind of useful. I'll probably put that down to the breakthrough that Google made in the transformer architecture.
Yes.
And that's kind of led us to the large language models, which kind of, and here we are. But for me, I mean, all we've ever done at VUX is talk about AI and cover AI and work with AI, and it's always been natural language. Like, natural language is the entry point to AI systems, essentially. And the sort of like the promise of natural language is that the interface should be super easy to use, because it shouldn't exclude anyone from using it as long as you can speak or type. It then also opens the door to that concept of ambient computing, which is that whatever you need to get done should just be an utterance or a whisper away, regardless of whatever device you're on. But also that presents itself, as fantastic as that dream is, it presents itself with some significant usability constraints. As you kind of likely well know, the 10 usability heuristics that you kind of famously documented in '94, there's impact on all of those things with AI, because people don't always know what it's actually able to do. And when you've just got language, you can't really explore the scope of a system because there's no you know what I'm saying?
No, that's nothing. I mean, it's actually back to DOS, right? It says C, and then it's like, what are you going to type to that C prompt? And it's the same, it's not the same, but the same point, that if you just give people a blank screen and say, you can type anything here, and then I'll make it happen. Now, the difference is that with DOS, you had to have an obscure syntax and no weird command names. And that's why most people could not use DOS properly. With AI, you can actually talk to it in natural language, so that's much easier. But you still have to know what to say, and that's what I call the articulation barrier, which is the ability to actually formulate what you want, which sounds easy, and it is easy for those sort of super intellectual people who are probably actually the audience for this podcast. But we have to remember that we are like the top 5% of the population in terms of ability to articulate complex problems. And the 95% of the population are perfectly able to live a normal life, but they're not able to have this high abstract thinking of really articulating it. So we need still ways of helping. And I mentioned before that there's this deep research product from both Google and OpenAI. And OpenAI's version has one, I think, gigantic usability improvement, which is you ask it what you want. I want, you go out research such and such and tell me, what's the best hotel in Tokyo or something like that. But then it asks you clarifying questions, because it just assumes correctly that, I mean, this is just an example of a problem I just had, that you don't know all of your own criteria, or you didn't think to articulate them. That's again the articulation barrier. So it knows, given the general point, you want hotels in a certain place. What are some of the issues? Like, do you want like a modern hotel or a traditional Japanese, as an example, which I didn't think of, but that's a very good question if you're planning on going to Tokyo. So it asks clarifying questions, and that's a great leap up in usability. There's actually two reasons it's a great leap up, and the one is that it facilitates this dialogue. But the second one is that it also overcomes the response time problem, because response times are one of the oldest usability issues. You want snappy computers. If you've got to sit and wait, it's snooze fest. People don't like that. But unfortunately, with the current technology, it does take 8 minutes because it's called deep research for a reason. It really goes out and compiles a lot of information into its report to you. That takes several minutes. 8 minutes was the example in the problem I gave it, but it takes several minutes. And that's much too long for computer response time. So if it first goes off and spends 8 minutes and then it comes back and says, or if it presents you a report and you think, oh, I need to actually clarify this or change this, that's a very slow back and forth dialogue with 8 minutes response time, or even 1 minute response time is still much too much. Remember back in the days when websites first came out, I was very strongly saying web response times for a page to download should ideally be 1 second, sub-second response time. We know this from a lot of research. Sub-second response time makes for good usability. But if you can't do 1 second, at least make it 10 seconds, because after 10 seconds, the user's mind starts to wander all over the place and you can't keep your focus. And that's, again, just biology. This is how the human brain works. We cannot keep our focus for more than 10 seconds unless we're engaged. But if you're just sitting there waiting, you drift. So 10 seconds was the absolutely slowest response time allowed for a website. And it's in many ways the same for an AI, except that, again, technology history repeats itself. We're back in this scenario where the technology is not quite up to it yet. So then we have to have design techniques to alleviate this problem. And that's what they've done. So I've been extremely critical of the lack of good usability in AI products. I mean, they have not done the entire user-centered design lifecycle that I've been promoting for 42 years. They have not actually done that. It's been extremely engineering focused, extremely focused on what they can build. And it's understandable because they're building miracles, basically, compared to what we could in the old days. But it also, the miracle has to be used. It's not beneficial if it just happens in the back room and nobody can interact with it. And so for years, also Midjourney can create wonderful pictures, but in the beginning, for many years, their user interface was absolutely terrible and violated so many usability principles. I actually wrote an article on my website, UX Tigers, kind of about this. And they were simple principles that we have known about for decades that they violated because they did not have any designers on the project. But now it's much better. So credit, right? They're much better now. Same as I just mentioned and point with OpenAI getting much better in the design of deep research. So we've noticed that they're slowly starting to infuse some human-centered design into their products. It's too bad it took a few years, but at least it's coming. So now we're on to kind of like the next step, which is the same thing needs to happen for all the many AI features, because AI is not just a matter of OpenAI versus Google versus the Chinese DeepSeek and whatever other products are out there. That gets all the press coverage, but actually most of the action is in vertical building of AI solutions, enterprise solutions or consumer solutions, but solutions for a human problem. That's why we have computers. That's also why we have AI. And those many hundreds of, probably thousands of companies building those vertical solutions, same story. They also need usability. They need to do user studies, user testing of people trying out their first idea, their first design idea, change it because first design idea is never good enough. That's one of his lessons from 40 years of doing this. It's never good enough. Nobody is the perfect user interface designer. It does not exist. So improve, iterate on the design and so forth. So that's kind of my what I'm fighting for, I guess, now.
Yeah, and me too. You know, we've been long advocates of the concept of conversation design, which is essentially the art and science of designing that back and forth dialogue with an AI system. And the stuff that you reference in there with deep research that's fundamentally what it's doing. It's beginning to have a conversation. You know, if you look at Amazon Alexa, Google Assistant, those were really just bark commands at them and you say one thing and it'll do something, turn on the lights, play some music. They never held a conversation. But there is a long practice of conversation analysis and there's really good solid research in terms of like what the building blocks of conversations are and really the kind of components that you need to have in a conversation. Not that we're trying to completely replicate a conversation, but you're trying to take the hallmarks of a conversation so that the interface is easier to use, and that asking clarifying questions, gathering enough information from the user before you actually go and do something is all kind of part of it. But I think it's interesting what you were talking about there in terms of there being a big usability issue. And I think OpenAI, you know, I think you're being kind to them there. I don't actually think OpenAI have got it particularly right, because, you know, if you go to ChatGPT, you've first of all got to pick what model you need to use. And that
Yeah.
then depends, you said quite rightly, sometimes the user can't always articulate what it is that they need. They've got an outcome in mind, but they can't necessarily put it down into words in terms of what it is that they need. And especially if you're a business, you might offer products and services. They might actually just be describing an issue to you. They might not necessarily know what the outcome is. They're just telling you what the issue is. So it's kind of like the design requirement is required in lots of different areas. So on the one hand, it's required by the model providers like the OpenAIs of the world. Then it's required on the verticalized solutions that you were referencing there in terms of the platforms that are providing solutions to enterprises. Their platforms have to be easy to use. And then you've got the enterprises that are designing and building their own use cases for their customers.
Oh, yes.
And so there's a third layer. So the usability issues is not just at the OpenAI level. It's all the way through the whole stack right to the end user.
It's all the way, and what happens with usability problems is they tend to kind of bubble up. But with your multiple levels, they all have to work correctly. So my best metaphor for this is like a chain. Like if you pull on a chain, the weakest link is where it breaks. So if you have multiple links in the chain, if you have multiple layers in your technology stack, all of those layers have to have good usability, or something will bubble up, and the user will not understand because the error messages will typically be incomprehensible. And you're right. I mean, it's not that OpenAI actually has good or great usability. I really was more referring to like 2 years ago versus now, and I can tell there are areas where they are improving. There are also areas where they're not improving, like the entire naming strategy. And this is just as bad with Google, by the way. The names of these models are just very incomprehensible. And, like, oh, 1 is better than 4.0. I mean, how is anybody going to understand that, make sense of that, unless you spend half your day on reading X and on the latest AI news? So honestly, the model selection is first of all something people shouldn't have to do. The computer or the AI should figure out for itself what's best for any given problem. But secondly, if we have to do it, at least you have to explain it in a decent way, and you have to use the names have to be comprehensible. And this is actually a very good example, by the way, of this concept of total user experience that I've been talking about for many years. So some people think that UI, user interface, is the same as UX, and it's like what buttons do you put on the screen, or what colors do you put on to make it pretty and things like that, which are important. I just want to point out, but user experience is actually more than that. So things like your company naming strategy becomes part of the user experience because it's one of the things that the customers have to understand. And if the names are poorly chosen by the abominable snowman or somebody like that, I think they have people in their marketing department who have like no clue how to talk to normal people. If their naming strategy is messed up, which it honestly is and has been terrible from the beginning, even things like GPT is like, that's a great technical term, but you don't want to expose that to the normal audience. So actually, I got to give credit to the Chinese DeepSeek that's a nice name. Then of course they had to bottle it up and call it DeepSeek R1, but okay. But anyway, the naming strategy is bad, and that becomes part of the user experience. So we have this concept called total user experience. And that's actually also another, I just want to point out to me, very important part of this, which is something I call AI stigma, which is that a lot of people stigmatize AI and don't actually value it properly and don't actually use it sufficiently. And it's the AI's fault. I mean, it's because of poor communication and poor design and poor usability of the AI products. So we need to empower users more so that people feel more comfortable using the AI, so they understand its limitations, which is it's getting better and better every month. It's getting better and better, but there are limitations. And how can any normal person be expected to understand those when they're changing all the time? So there has to be communicated clearly. Communicate when it has high confidence versus low confidence in the recommendation, or more user control or freedom, which is one of my old 10 usability heuristics. One of the 10 most fundamental things in designing a good experience is user control and freedom, which is still awkward to control these things through these prompts. And so we can go on like a long list of these kind of problems that makes it harder for users to really feel that they are in control and they feel that it's a partnership. I really do feel like this synergy effect is very, very valuable if we can make it happen. But a lot of people do not feel that. And for example, there's a lot of research on using AI for medical diagnosis. And most of these studies show that AI is actually better than human doctors. Once it gets the test lab data and all that, it can look through that and figure out what's the problem and give out a diagnosis for that patient, which is better than what the average human doctor can do. So now you would think, right, because again, synergy is what we want to have, because human doctors have their own advantages as well. If you combine the two, it should get even better, but no, it does not. And it does in the studies. And in the studies, it actually gets worse, or at least not better, when you take an AI diagnosis and you add a human doctor to it, because the human doctors tend to undervalue the advice they get from AI. And that is because, and again, the blame can be put squarely on the AI providers for not doing proper design that would enhance these physicians' trust in the AI. But it's nevertheless, so that's what I call AI stigma. People are stigmatizing AI relative to how good it actually is. It's not perfect, but it's not terrible. It's kind of whatever it is at. If people had appropriate understanding and appropriate level of control over the AI, I do think that stigma would go away and we would actually get better results. So that's a great example of how the total user experience impacts the quality of the result of using a product, in this case, an AI product.
Yeah, definitely. There's been some kind of attempts at trying to, I think, build trust with stuff like, sources and here's where we got the information from and all that kind of stuff. But I think that even so, you look at the early examples of Bing Chat or Bing GPT or whatever it was they were calling it. And it's like, it'll give you the source, but the information that it gives you is still wrong. So it's like, in the same way as maybe Amazon Alexa, when it was launched in 2014, maybe did a poor job at building confidence because it promises the world, but actually all it's going to do is play music. So you ask it for something and it can't quite do, and it's not going to give it to you. And it's the same sort of situation I think we got ourselves in the early days of ChatGPT, whereas like Bing Chat and all that kind of stuff, it's like it's promising the world, but it still can't get things right. So it hasn't necessarily got off to a great sort of start. But I think that it's getting better now. I think confidence and trust will grow, but maybe part of that stigma is that, would you agree that it's that because of the media attention that AI gets, and obviously OpenAI, they're raising funds every 6 weeks, and so it's kind of like they have to keep this kind of story going. And so the media narrative is that AI is either super dangerous because it's going to be coming and affecting our elections and all that kind of stuff, or it's going to replace everybody's jobs. And so maybe this sort of like narrative among some people is that maybe there's a trust issue there because they think it might be coming for their jobs. Whereas, there's a lot of research out there. Essentially, you alluded to some of it at the beginning, which was that the studies that have been done where people are using AI performing better and getting better results. And so the reality is that AI is there to help and be a productivity enhancer. But I think there's still that stigma about it's going to take our jobs. And I know you've wrote fairly recently about the whole kind of that sort of same stigma in the UX kind of field in terms of like, is AI going to take away the job of a UX designer? Whereas in actual fact, it's kind of about enhancing that. So I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding with a lot of people in terms of what the point of AI is.
No, I think you're right, and part of that is the AI's fault, but part of it in this example you bring up, it's also the press coverage fault, because that is sensationalist, which is the history of the press. For hundreds of years, it's always been, if it bleeds, it leads. That has always been the thing, and the man bites dog gets a headline, and the dog bites a man, which is what happens every day. They never cover. So this, it's not necessarily they're particularly evil in terms of picking on AI, but it's sort of the bias they have in their blood. And so, but that does again impact that user experience and people's thinking about AI, is they're getting this biased coverage that is focusing on negative things. And the fixed job fallacy is such an easy trap for people to fall into, of thinking that if AI can make people twice as productive, which I think is very realistic for the next few years, we can fire half the people because the other half can then do all the work. And that would be true if there was a fixed amount of work to be done in the world, but that is not the case. I mean, it's not the case that we cannot think of more interesting things we want to do with ourselves. And this is where history actually proves the point very, very strongly, because we've had productivity gains in the past, like the agricultural revolution, a farmer can grow much more food than a hunter can bring in. Or then we had the industrial revolution, and factories can produce many more things than handmade, in the old days. And there's always been a lot of productivity improvements, and they actually amount, if you add them up over 100 years, to become enormously big. So we're now at the stage where in the advanced or industrialized countries in the world, it's about 3% of the population are employed as farmers or in agriculture, and that used to be almost 100%. Almost everybody needs to spend all of their work life just making our food so that we could eat, because it was labor-intensive work. And even once they started having like a horse to the plow and all that, that's not the same as a tractor. A tractor is much better than a horse, right? And all the other improvements that have happened since then as well. And what is the result of this? Is it's the result that 3% of the population work in farming and 97% of the population are unemployed? No. 97% of the population have jobs that nobody knew about 200 years ago. We've invented so many new things to do. And that's why I believe that there is no end. I mean, literally, there's no end to things we can think up. Some things we can think up now that are impossible, therefore they will not get done. But as more things become possible, more things will therefore also get done. And we can think of even more new things that I can right now not think of what would be a great idea for somebody to do in 20 years. But in 20 years from now, somebody will think of that idea and they will start that company and that will employ those people. So I am 100% confident, because that's this history for 10,000 years since sort of the agricultural revolution. It was not the case that 90% of the Stone Age population became unemployed hunters. No, they started doing farming instead. And the same is going to be true here. For 10,000 years, this has always been true that when new technology came out, when people got more productive, they could do more things. What happened as a result of that was more things got done. Not just that the old things got done more efficiently and half the people were unemployed. No, all the people were still employed, but just doing new things. That, I'm convinced, will happen again. But something that's been true for 10,000 years is going to continue to be true for the next 100 years as well.
Yeah, 100%. There was a brilliant study that the World Economic Forum released last year, which essentially showed that I might be getting the numbers wrong, but it's something along these lines, is that something like 42% of Americans are in jobs that didn't exist even 40 years ago. And so that's the level that we're sort of dealing with. And it's like work always fills up the available time that there is for it anyway. You might get more done in the day.
That's also true.
Yes, it's not like you're just going to sack everyone. But also, you're right. I think that one of the biggest problems that businesses have particularly is like, okay, if we put AI in front of our sort of like all of our service channels, and then like only 20% of contacts get through to our agents, then now we're going to sack 80% of our people. But the reality is that there are things that, as you said, you might not be thinking about right now, but you could do instead. Like IKEA's got a great example. They automated 50% of all incoming conversations on the phone, and then they redeployed 50% of their workforce to be interior designers, and now they're selling their time for $40 an appointment, and it's like they've just made a business out of it.
No, that's a great example. And I think another way of thinking about it is that there are many services or products that maybe we can think of now, but they're too expensive for it to be realistic that customers would buy it. But if we can improve people's productivity so they're twice as productive, that means the cost is half for each product. Well, now more people will buy those products, so therefore they become realistic to actually offer. Cutting costs in half, that's actually a very, very timid prediction. I think it's more going to be going to be cut by a factor of 10. So like 10% of what it used to cost, something that used to cost $10 will cost $1. Or let's say something that used to cost $1,000 will cost $100. And now all of a sudden people will buy it, which means we'll start making it. So that I think is a very, very realistic prediction, is that. And then there's all the new things we can think of as well that I, of course, cannot tell you today what people will think about in 10 years, but I know from history they will think of new things in 10 years.
Definitely. I'm curious about the 10 heuristics that you put together in 1994, the 10 usability heuristics. I've got a bit of a version of them here. Maybe I'll flash these up, and I'm going to link to all these in the show notes and that as well, so people can go and
Good,
download
thank you.
them. But I won't go through every single one of them, but I'll name a couple just off the bat so people can understand kind of what they are. So we've got the visibility of system status is one heuristic. Design should keep users informed about what's going on through appropriate timely feedback. The user control and freedom, which you referenced earlier on, is one. Consistency and standards. Users shouldn't have to wonder whether different words, situations, or actions mean the same thing. These heuristics that have stood the test of time over the last 3 decades actually,
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
that have stood the test of time, are these impacted or changed in the world of AI, or are all of these just as relevant and just as important in a world where we interact with AI as an increasing kind of human-computer interaction modality?
Well, I mean, I think they're just as relevant, and the reason for that is that they are heuristics. And so heuristics is a word that I came up with that I slightly regret because a lot of people don't quite understand it. But heuristics means something that's a rule of thumb or general insight. It's not a very specific insight. So you'll notice that just the ones you quoted are pretty general principles. And they're principles that relate to basically bridging the gap between humans and computers, or between the need and the solution. And so that gap will always be there. And so how do we bridge it? And we have to bridge it relative to our understanding of human behavior, human brain, basically. And the human brain does not change. Now, the specifics of what we do, because again, it's two sides of this equation. So the specific of what we do on the computer side will change depending on our technology. So in the old days, we had, command line interfaces. Then we got graphical user interface. You could click on things on the screen. When that meant we had to start thinking about this problem about visibility of system status could actually become literally visibility, show it. Whereas in the old days with command lines, it was more describe it. Well, now we're changing to this more communication-based or dialogue-based conversation design model. Maybe it's not visibility in the sense of having an icon, or maybe it is, but I mean, that will have to be teased out. But the general point that people should know what's going on, well, that's the same, because that relates to, again, that human brain. And we not just do we want to know, but we actually need to know, because otherwise we cannot formulate our next step if we don't know the results of the previous step. And so the principles are so general. That's why they're heuristics. And that's why you have to interpret them, which is a downside of this methodology. But the upside is that once you learn them, you can apply them for decade after decade across technology generations. And I developed this is the current list of 10 heuristics back when I worked at the phone company at Bell Communications Research in the United States. That was the telephone company research lab. It has a very glorious history of doing good user experience work, actually. Back from when they designed the push button telephone. So because you have these the numbers 1 through 9 and 0, how should they be laid out? That's not an obvious question, but they actually did human studies and discovered the best layout for very fast entry of phone numbers. And so this is before my time, but that was one of the early projects they did at the labs. But when I worked there, so I worked on a lot of telephone company products. And some of them were graphical user interfaces, but some of them were telephony products where you would call up and you would push buttons and you would speak to an early voice response system and things like that. So even back when they were developed, they were actually developed under the thinking of having different types of interaction modes and different technologies for the interaction design. And they held steady, back since those 30 years ago computers, to the more recent computers, to mobile computers, which of course, even though I worked at a phone company, we didn't really think about smartphones back then, but the heuristics have completely held up for smartphone designs, for app designs for phones, and they're holding up just as well also for AI products. I think the main problem is that so many AI products are currently not designed with these principles in mind, and that's why they have a variety of weaknesses, despite this immense strength. The utility, the use we get out of them could be so much more if they were better designed, taking human capabilities and human needs more into consideration. And I just want to point this out, that we talked before about that the scaling law. If you spend more gold, it gets more bold. I mean, it gets better. but there's so far those scaling laws have mainly been technological scaling laws. And the more compute you throw at AI, the smarter it becomes. But there's actually another scaling law as well, which is the more design resources or usability resources you throw at designing the product, the better it also becomes. Because we actually should measure the value of a product not by its kind of abstract or inherent abilities, which is what the compute is, but we should measure it based on what the humans or the users or the customers, paying customers, what the paying customers get out of it. And what they get out of it is that capability mediated through that user interface and the usability and the user experience. And so if you have weakness here, but you're trying to push through a bad layer and you're not going to get as much permeate and come to the usefulness of the customer, the paying customer. And so if we can actually improve that last step of going from the screen or the voice channel, whatever it is, but from the computer generating stuff to us absorbing and understanding stuff and directing the computer, the AI, in what direction it want to go. I mean, that will vastly enhance the utility, the gain, the value. Again, if we go back to plain economics, right? Hire 10 people, hire 100 people, even for some of the big companies like OpenAI, should absolutely have a design team of 100 people or more. And they don't. They have like a handful of people. So they should scale that effort on making it useful to the customers dramatically more, and that would gain the value, improve the value, not so much the capability. That's still engineer's job to make that, and this is an important job. I'm not at all undervaluing that, but you also need to invest in the communication part or the usage part of these products, and it's starting to do it, but it's still slow, it's lacking. It's not that investment, not where it should be. That needs to scale a lot, and that's another scaling law that these companies are not taking advantage of right now. Is they can scale design effort, and that's relatively cheap. You don't have to build like a computer center with 1 million chips. You just need to hire 100 people, and with AI's help, 100 people in 5 years can do the job of 1,000 people 5 years ago. So.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, look at all the big companies, the Netflixes and the Ubers and the Amazons of the world. Like, they have design teams that just focus on very specific problems. Like, one design team is just focused on the checkout. One's just focused on search. One's just focused on, results pages or later pages. I think you're right that there's so much that can be learnt there. But I'm curious in terms of your thoughts of like, where do you see the biggest need for usability design thinking at the moment? Do you think it's more at the kind of like the OpenAI level, as in like the mass market products? So for example, like the Alexa level, the OpenAI ChatGPT level, the Google Gemini kind of consumer level, the Microsoft Copilot level? Or do you think it's at the level underneath that, which is that organizations incorporating AI into their products? That could be customer service products. It could be incorporated into their app. Like, however they incorporate AI into their products themselves, that needs to be thought about in terms of design and usability. But then also that same technology can be used in the day-to-day life of a UI UX usability designer to help them do things faster, be more productive. Like, where do you think that the biggest need is right now? Is it at the top consumer level? Is it at the business application level? Or is it at the kind of like incorporating AI into existing workflows level?
Right. Well, I would say that all three should be done, and I don't think there is a conflict between doing them, because I think all three will have extremely high return on investment. And there are right now about 3 million user experience professionals in the world who are, I mean, they're not all brilliant, of course. They vary in talent like in any other profession, but there's enough good ones anyway that we could actually do all three of these things. But in terms of what will have the highest return on investment or be most important to do, I think it's probably that middle point you mentioned, which is the vertical or specialized applications, because they're the ones who will be the tightest to the customers and which really needs to fit very, very well with the customer's needs. And I think that's also where you can build a sustainable business by doing that, because we actually know that for the foundation models, it's very hard to actually keep a sustained lead on that, because as soon as one company comes out with something, like Google actually launched deep research before OpenAI. Now OpenAI can come out with something that I think is better than Google's. Well, maybe next month Google's will be better. I mean, so that they go like that. Or you know, the American AI products had, you know, a certain level of quality, and then so all of a sudden there's like a Chinese product comes out and does just as good for, you know, 1/45th. I mean, so like 2% of the cost. It's amazingly how good those Chinese programmers are. So there's very little sustained advantage to just being best at the foundation level of AI, because it's just general. It's kind of like saying, is there any sustained advantage in having a high IQ for a human? And in some ways, there's not, because there's another smart person down the street. And if you don't want that, there's the million smart people in China, and there's another one in Australia, and so forth. I mean, so just that you are very high IQ, I mean, certainly better than being stupid, but it doesn't actually mean that you have the sustained advantage. What the sustained advantage is that you can actually do something that other people cannot do. And another smart person, yeah, they could spend 10 years learning that, and then they could do it as well. But, you know, right now you're the one who can do it. And I actually remember this because it's my very personal history, which is back when, during the dot-com bubble, I was one of the only people who actually knew how to make websites that actually worked for the way users behaved on the internet, because I was the only one of the few, I should say, to be honest, one of the few who had actually studied and watched and observed users use the websites of the day of the mid 1990s. And so that gave me for a few years that kind of sustained advantage of being like the primary source of web usability. So that was a great sustained advantage, knowing something specific, not just being smart. It's great to be smart, but it's better to know something. And I think it's the same here. If you design an AI product that actually fits users' workflow, and when I say fit users' workflow, it doesn't necessarily mean the way they do it now, because sometimes the workflow changes when capabilities change. So we have to kind of co-design the two together. But if we can do a product that really makes people, for some practical problem in the world, in the real world, that makes people dramatically more productive and satisfied and happy and every good thing, that is the more sustainable advantage. Of course, somebody else can come 5 years later and spend 5 years building it, but we have that. If we do it now, we have that advantage compared to somebody else who comes and wants to do it later. And sometimes it's called the moat, or like a medieval fortress. You have a moat around it. So like the competitor has to cross that moat to attack you. And so what type of moat can we build? And one of the best or deepest moats in that analogy is for having a workflow that fits like a hand in glove, that really fits, a good glove, basically, for the user's hand. User's hand is given, you know. Some people have big hands, I have a small hand, whatever it is, make a glove for that hand, and then you have a fit. And so that's a good mode. And the other good mode as well is actually in being very tailored to that user, which is something we're not quite seeing yet, but I think that's emerging, of the AI products having a better understanding of their specific individual user rather than giving the same information to everybody. And so if you change to a new product, all of a sudden you lose all of that individualization of the system, personalizing it to understanding you because you've worked with it for several years already. That becomes hard. You can move, but it becomes a pain to do it, and there becomes some inertia to moving. Right now, there's no inertia. I mean, DeepSeek from China comes out next day. As soon as I read about it, I'm on it and I'm using it for my work, and I feed fewer prompts into Claude from Sonnet from Anthropic. You know, every day, anything new comes out, I'll just switch to trying that out. But if it was very customized to my needs, I would have a harder time switching.
Yeah, I think Apple have proven that, haven't they? You know, the first example of making the workflow fit like a glove, you know, they've got very good devices, work really well, operating system wrapped around it, works really well. And then the moat is that once you're deeply entrenched and embedded in Apple Mail and iMessages and Apple Photos and Apple Music, it's like it knows you so well, it's so hard to move away from it. So it's kind of like,
Exactly.
yeah, totally agree.
And that's, of course, that's of course their devious plan for why they're introducing all these products, but they're also useful as well, which is why people use them. So again, it's a duality to that.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. One of the things that you spoke about and wrote about previously in the past as well is something that I've actually referenced myself without actually knowing that this is the case. So you talk about the Jacob's law of internet user experience, which for those that don't know, it's essentially like if a person has a lot of experience of using other websites and the design functions and heuristics and mental models of using those websites do not transpose to your website, as in you do something totally differently and the whole UI is different, it's harder for them to use, and they'll just disappear. And I've kind of used the analogy in the past of Google search, for example, being one example. So once you get used to using Google search, every other search box on every other website, you have an expectation that it's going to behave like Google search, because that's what shaped your expectations. The same thing with like Amazon, for example. You order a product on Amazon, you expect it to be delivered the next day because it normally is. And now whenever you go to any other website, you've got this expectation that this package should be delivered within 24 hours, and it shouldn't really cost me any extra. And so the experiences that you have that are set elsewhere are carried into your expectations of what you expect from products and services and businesses in other areas. And I've always been of the belief, even from the days of Amazon Alexa, that when people get comfortable talking to inanimate devices and those things understand them and can serve them, when people get used to typing commands, even if they're not very well formulated, at something like ChatGPT, and it can figure out what you mean and do stuff for you, then it raises the expectations of every chat interface that they then come across from that moment on, whether it's voice or text or whatever, which then raises the pressure, if you like, for businesses to be able to respond with great user experiences, because that's fundamentally what it is. The interface has to understand you, it has to be able to do something on your behalf, and it has to be able to resolve your issue. And so if that expectation is there, it kind of forces businesses to do something about it. That's always been my kind of concept in terms of the way I've been thinking about it. And when I saw that kind of the stuff that you'd published around the kind of the similar sort of concept, I was enthused, but I'm curious about kind of like, do you think that is the case when it comes to AI, or do you think that, to be honest, it's interacting with AI at this moment in time is a relatively small part of most people's life, and so right. For me, it's all day, every day. So I think maybe there's more of it than otherwise. But do you think there's something to that the more people interact with tools like ChatGPT, the higher their expectations get, and therefore the more pressure is on businesses to incorporate that same level of experience into their products and services?
Absolutely, I think so. But you have to remember, so Jacob's law is about accumulated expectations. So the accumulation is the important part of the law, because it does not say, if I once see something on another website, I will therefore think your website should be that way as well. What Jacob's law says is that people spend most of their time on other websites than your website, and therefore the cumulative experience of all these other websites becomes their expectation for your website. So if, they spend a lot of time, or maybe they spend a lot of time on one website like Google and they spend a little time on other websites, it's really the accumulation that's the point. But if people have a lot of impressions from a certain way of doing things, that sets their expectations. So if there's only one encounter, it actually doesn't mean anything. It's many encounters. And you're probably right that for most people, that's not there yet with AI. But that's, again, my prediction that is definitely going to change, and very rapidly so. And so most people are going to use AI frequently, and then it becomes like websites. Before, let's say a company starts a new website, by the time somebody gets to that new website, they will already have seen 10,000 other web pages on other websites, because the web is not new anymore. And the same is going to be true for AI. By the time somebody launches a new AI feature, the customer will already have spent hundreds of hours or thousands of hours possibly using existing AI features. So I think that is going to happen. It may not quite be true yet, but it definitely will impact enterprise products or vertical products just as much. And I can again go back to the web as a very great analogy, historical analogy to the way AI will become ubiquitous. I cannot tell how many users I've seen in user testing say quotes like the following, which says, it's this easy for me to complete this transaction when I go to Amazon and I pay $10 to buy a book? Why is it so hard when I'm going to spend not $10 but $10,000 with you, and your user interface is terrible? Why? I mean, it makes no sense, right? For the customer's perspective, it makes no sense. If it's easy to spend $10, why is it difficult to spend 10,000? You should get more, not less, when you're paying more money. And so that has definitely led to a negative impression of a lot of enterprise products, because they are not, to be honest, most of them are not as smooth and easy to use as the generic big e-commerce websites. Amazon is a good example, but there are many others as well. And actually, I should say one thing that's a caveat here is this does not mean that one should just like do a copy paste on the Amazon website, leaving aside copyright problems, but just from a usability perspective, because design needs to satisfy a function or goal, right? And so it's this kind of like form follows function, kind of very old principle. And so Amazon's design supplies this notion that they have, millions of products that they sell of all possible types. But they do sell books, that was their original thing, but they sell other thing as well. And that means that has certain implications for how they structure their homepage and their search and all these type of things. And if you're a company that does more like one specific thing, you don't have that generalization problem. So you can actually design better than Amazon. So in fact, Amazon shouldn't even be your bar. That should be the low bar, and you should be better than Amazon because you have a more specific target in mind.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, definitely. Final thoughts. I know we're kind of on time, and I want to be respectful of your time. The final thoughts in terms of like, when you first got into UX design in the 90s or perhaps before, it was obviously early days. The first kind of the internet bubble and all that kind of stuff kind of went on. And over the years, you've kind of seen, maturity develop in the space of web design, and then maturity develop in the space of mobile. And then now that kind of AI is reaching that kind of like mainstream awareness, a lot of people that we speak to on the podcast, they always say it's early days. It's early days. But, when we've been doing this for 7.5 years, 8 years, as we have, and this podcast been going for 7 years, and we've talked about nothing but implementing AI in businesses and the design implications, etc. So it's kind of like, it doesn't feel like early days, for me at least. It feels as though we're kind of, we've been banging this drum for a long time, which is, one, the impact that AI is having and will have on businesses, and two, the importance of creating and designing really great experiences that work for the end user that also contribute to the business. So it feels like we've been kind of banging that same drum, and it doesn't feel like early days for me, but it feels like early days for lots of other people. So if we were to kind of like think about when you were sort of getting started in UX design, from your perspective, does it feel the same? Does it feel like early days, or does it feel like we're kind of, beginning to mature? Or like, where do you think we are on the whole kind of AI adoption and AI usability requirement?
I actually think it is still early days, despite it being 8 years into it. I mean, that's actually a short time period in many ways. I mean, if you think about it, I think the web is actually a very great analogy. It's only an analogy. It's not that history will repeat itself identically, but it does rhyme. So the web was actually invented in 1991, I believe. And I saw the web, the first time I saw the web, World Wide Web, was at a hypertext conference in 91. Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor, was doing a demo. And my thought was, this is very primitive. It's an interesting academic experiment from these physics geeks in Switzerland. But, Apple's HyperCard is the great product, and their product is line mode, text only. It's not very exciting. Mm-hmm. Then 93, the web got a graphical user interface. It started taking off. And then in maybe 97, 98, we started doing that kind of e-commerce bubble. But so 98 versus 91, that's a 7-year period from inventing the web to the first kind of relatively big e-commerce products. Then boom, e-commerce bubble was bursting 2001, 10 years later. And now, well, actually, when I say now, we can go back 10 years ago. So that would have been 2015 or something like that. That was when the web has matured. You can buy basically anything you want. You can get almost any information you want. There's a lot of features and so forth. But that took a good amount of time from inventing it to it becoming practical, to it becoming big, to it becoming mature. I mean, there's the steps that we have to go through. I think the thing we can leverage or benefit is of that history is that maybe we can do it a little faster this time because an AI can help with itself, because one of the problems with AI is actually education and training and getting people to understand it. But AI is a great education tool. AI upskills people. That's one of it's a seniority accelerant. It helps people become efficient faster. So we can use AI as a teacher and it can therefore help on the education problem, but there's still going to be an education problem. You cannot just take the millions or billions of business professionals in the world and say, here's a new tool, just be brilliant at using it. You've got to help them. So I think that organizational change always takes longer time than technology change. So I still do think it's early. I completely agree with you that it's very annoying to have been pushing for something for many years, and it's not just understood by everybody that of course that's the way it is, but it just takes time to convince people, for them to get the personal experience, them to have that success experience, which they will have because AI is successful, but they can also have failures if they try to use it in the wrong way. This is why education becomes important. So I think it's a gradual process, and I would say my conclusion is it's still early days. I really think it's more like 2030, so like 5 years from the day we're recording this.
Mm-hmm.
5 years from now is more when we will have AI maturity, is my guess.
Interesting, very interesting. And what would your final question? What would your kind of advice be to those that are kind of working in the field right now? Maybe they're building products and SaaS companies, the future of AI applications. Maybe they're UX designers wanting and wondering how they get into this. Maybe they're business owners or business leaders looking at starting to incorporate this stuff in their either daily life or in their business life. What's your kind of, I suppose, parting piece of advice for those that are curious and wanting to develop that maturity?
I would say just do it, and we are on a growth curve, and it's in a dramatically accelerating exponential growth curve, and so that means that things will be changing faster and faster and faster year for year for year. And so don't get discouraged because not everything happens in a year. This is just now not how the world is. And I've seen this many times. I started doing usability actually back in 1983. That's how old I am. I started doing it back when the early DOS days, PC DOS days, things like that. And it was terrible. Computers were terrible. User interfaces were terrible. And I said, I know how to make them better. Yeah, you can fast forward 10 years, they were better, but they were still bad. I mean, it takes a long time. And even today, after I've worked on this for 42 years, I still would not say that usability is perfect either. It's getting better. It's getting better every year. And so that's my advice. The only way you get better at this is by doing it. And the people, let's say that my prediction is right, that in 5 years, it will be the true glory day for AI. When it has super intelligence and all these things become much more practical than they are now. It's a little bit of a struggle to do certain things. Well, who are the people who will have like the great jobs and be in extreme demand in 5 years? Those are people who have 5 years experience with how to do these AI designs and implement and design and use and launch and roll out all these different aspects of a product. Product design has many stages to it, right? But you need a lot of experience in doing this, and you can get into it at any time. But the only way you can have 5 years experience in 5 years is by starting now. Right? The best would have been to start 5 years ago. So you're in a happy situation. You started more than 5 years ago, but that's too late. We don't have a time machine. But the thing we do have is if you start now, you will have 5 years experience in 5 years, and you will be the one in huge demand. You can write your own ticket.
Yeah, agreed. I kind of, there's a guy called Charlie Cadbury who once shared this kind of perspective with me, and I agree completely, which is that if you think about where we are as a pyramid, and over time, more and more people are going to get involved in this discipline. We're kind of at the top of the pyramid at the moment, and we're kind of shaping what's to come beneath us, and therefore, passing down that best practice and all that kind of stuff is what kind of needs to happen. And it's funny because, you look at certain kind of deployments or certain technologies or certain tools, and you can see that they often violate some of the already established conversation design best practice, and much of that comes from, you know, UX best practice and likely your 10 heuristics and stuff like that. And it's like, so it's clear that, like, as more and more get into the space, the importance of standardization, not standardization for the sake of it, but I mean, like, the dissemination of best practices as it's emerging and changing is going to be really important.
Yeah, and the nuanced application of the best practices. I think best practices are absolutely accumulating. It's still too new for us to know everything, but we know more and more every day. And then there's the nuance of how to apply them, which is that's what comes from practice and experience and from doing it, not just talking about it, but doing it. So doing AI products, being in product development and accelerated product teams that are using AI. There's a duality. Use AI to design AI, then you get the best of both worlds. And don't get discouraged because not everything is perfect from the beginning, and because we have a known principle and somebody is violating it. This has happened for my entire career. I've had things I've been writing about 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and people will violate today as well. But the beautiful news is that fewer and fewer of these violations happen as the years go by. More and more of the established principles become so established that people are following them after all. It just takes a while, that's sad to say. But I would really say my really closing message is probably to say that, you know, this phrase about may you live in interesting times, some people say it's supposed to be a curse. I actually think it's a blessing. You know, this is the interesting time. This is probably the most interesting time in my entire career. The dot-com bubble was very exciting, but I think the AI revolution is bigger. And it's also moving faster as well because there's this true acceleration from the scaling laws. So if you combine those things, now is super exciting, and yet it's still beginning. So we have a chance to get in, not on the very ground floor. That train is already left the station, but we can get in. People can get in while it's early, and they can ride. It's a rocket. It's a bang. It's going up, and it's again exponential growth curves, and they bend. And that's what's happening now. So yeah, may you live in interesting times. Yes, you do live in interesting times. So take advantage of that.
Brilliant, brilliant. Jakob Nielsen, thank you so much. Thank you, one, for joining me, and thank you, two, for everything that you've done for this whole field over the years. It's shaped and influenced my career, this business that we have now, and lots, I'm sure, lots and lots of other people as well. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you. I think that's great to hear, actually. This is why I did it for all these many years, because, you know, it was a struggle all the time, but people are listening, so that's great.
Good. And if we have even 0.01% of the impact that you've had, if we can have that kind of small impact in this field as well, then I'll be very happy in years to come. So thank you so much. And thank you all for tuning in. Really, really appreciate it. See you next week at the same bat time, same bat channel. Thank you so much. Bye now.